So welcome to our second virtual Brownbag seminar of the Center for Southeast European Studies. I'm very glad that Isil Erdinç is joining us. She is a virtual visiting fellow at the moment at the center. She is based in Paris. She's teaching at Sorbonne, where she also did her PhD. She recently completed a postdoc at Paris Dauphine. She's been looking a lot on questions of authoritarianism in Turkey on a number of angles, also role of trade unions in Turkey, but she will be today presenting her current research on mobilizations and Turkish lobbies in Europe in an authoritarian context, long distance activism, looking back at the last 4 years. So Isil, thank you so much for joining us, even if it's not in person, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Yes, thank you for your invitation to present my current research. So, as you have said, this research is a part of my ongoing research that I started that I started last year, which is on businessmen and especially businessmen associations in Europe. First, I was looking. In fact, the object of my research was to work on long distance activism and on working the exiled social activists, from Turkey, especially after the military coup attempt that I will talk about, which has occurred in July 2016. However, when I did an explanatory field work in Brussels last year, during on a research field, I discovered that it was really interesting to analyze also those who were already abroad before the political regime became more and more authoritarian. So I was interested in their strategies and their practices to see how they cope with Turkey's relations with the European countries and European, especially economic actors. And I asked myself, what do these activists or lobbyists who were already in Europe before the regime got more and more close, so closer and closer. So this is why I started to work mainly on businessmen associations, because during my PhD I worked on labor unions, I worked on trade unions, so I was asking myself, so if maybe I just change my side and then to see what the businessmen do, so what the employers do, if they do also act, if they also have some collective action strategies, or how do they do their lobbying, so differently from the labor trade unions. So my field research is I decided to just frame my field research on businessmen associations in Europe and their practices and strategies under the authoritarian political regime in Turkey, especially since 2016 and to today. So today I will start talking about really briefly what Turkey has been passing through under the Justice and Development Party rule, which is who is in power since 2002. And then I'll try to introduce just briefly what European Union, what EU and Turkey's relations, what they have been passing through, and in the end, and then I will start talking about briefly the conceptual framework of my research, and especially the concept of long distance activism, which comes from another concept which is created by Benedict Anderson, which is the concept of long distance nationalism. So those two concepts I will see. So the main conceptual framework of my research is to see if it's possible, if the coexistence of these two notions is possible when we analyze collective action strategies of the businessmen associations in Europe. And I will pass to my field work and talk about this first field work that I could do in last year in Brussels and also in Istanbul with Turkish businessmen in order to see how can an association or can a lobby in diaspora, so abroad, can do lobbying when the cause does no longer exist. What does this mean? So I will explain. I will start explaining now. As I've said, this is the presentation of my fieldwork. In Turkey, the AKP role, the AKP, so the Justice and Development Party, who is in power since 2002, has in the beginning of its government, its arrival to governance, to the government, it has invested the country and itself to do reforms on European Union, and in order to assure a certain advancement in negotiations with the European Union and Turkey. So, of course, in order to underline that the membership application of Turkey to the European Union is on till since the 1950s. So 1950s, 1960s, and we have this rise in the number of reforms in order to access to European Union. However, after a couple of years later, so the AKP has disengaged progressively more and more from the European Union membership. So the reforms have lost their speed, and the AKP has started to adopt a less and less pro-European discourse. So lots of the relations between European countries have deteriorated, and a membership to European Union has become or has lost itself as something in the horizon of Turkish politics. So this is why I was interested in the lobbies who were working in Europe since the 1990s in order to assure or in order to accelerate Turkey's accession to the European Union. So since the European Union membership is no longer a question in Turkey, because also since the regime got more and more authoritarian, the European Union side also closed the negotiations or suspended lots of chapters, suspended several chapter negotiations, suspended the negotiations in several chapters. So this is why suddenly especially after the 2016, 2015, when the regime got more authoritarian, the European side and the Turkey side has suspended or has de facto suspended the negotiations. So how to do lobbying when the cause does no longer exist? So do you still work, or do you still continue working, or do you just go back to Turkey and then accept the fact that this cause does no longer exist and your reason of being does no longer exist? So I asked myself this question, and I was wondering if I found out for a first hypothesis after my field work that these business associations who are lobbying for the Turkey's EU membership since the 1990s have some kind of an attitude like Don Quixote, who is fighting against the windmills in the book. In order to just fight against something that no longer exists. So this is why I will explain now for this attitude of fighting against the windmills and what does it mean for Turkish businessmen. So the field work, so the start of my field work is this. With the couple of interviews in Brussels, in Istanbul, and some participant observations in meetings in Turkey and EU meetings in Brussels, and I was aiming to also focus on a sectoral approach by textile and metal and also road transport sector industry. But because of the sanitary crisis, my field work is now online, so that I will be no longer, I guess, I will be able to conduct interviews in Germany or in Austria with the businessmen who are doing affairs with these countries. These interviews will be only online, I guess. So where does this come from? So this is the literature review, or the conceptual framework of my research is mainly based on activism, the literature on activism beyond borders, and to see also how to mobilize under authoritarian context. So how to still convince the European countries that Turkey is a European country, while in Turkey the practices and the policies show that the country is getting more and more authoritarian. So I won't, of course, get into the detail with the literature and with the conceptual framework. So if you have any questions, I can return that after my presentation. If you have any questions to see how I relate this conceptual framework to my field. So to start with to focus on the field work. So the Turkish diaspora in Europe is a really historical diaspora. However, when we focus on the businessmen associations and the business side of this lobbying or of this diaspora, we can say that it's more recent. So it's mostly depends, or it goes back to the customs union in 1995. When Turkey has signed an agreement with the European Union, with the European countries, about the merchandises and about the transports and about the exports and imports with special tariffs for the EU countries. So most of the Turkish businessmen associations that are in Europe are opened after this customs union agreement. However, of course, this diaspora, this European or this Turkish businessman lobby abroad in Europe has been changing recently, especially under the AKP rule, where now also there are some since 2016 we observe more a migration of an exile, we can say, of the small businessmen, or even the business investments of Turkish businessmen to Europe. So they, since the political regime is becoming more and more authoritarian, and there are more and more restrictions in economy, and the economy is getting worse and worse in Turkey, the businessmen invest more and more, and sometimes the small business they migrate to Europe in order to save their capital. So this is why this diaspora is changing, or this lobby is changing, and I started to do my interview with the lobby that exists since the 1995, since the customs union, in order to see in order to start with the strategies of those associations, those businessmen associations who were in Europe, who are in Europe since the customs union. So I saw that there are three strategies. So with the businessmen, three main strategies exist. So the first strategy to lobby when the cause does no longer exist is to repair the past issues. So the repair the issues that are blocking the EU membership of Turkey since the 2000s, especially, or since the 1990s. The first issues that came up with my interviews, from my interviews, was the Cyprus issue. I will talk about that. And the second issue was the customs issue. So repairing the past issues was their first strategy in order to do lobbying in this situation. And the second strategy was rewriting the present, which was the most, when I was there, especially last year, which was one of the most important strategies that they invested during this process. It was rewriting the present, because when you see that the political regime is becoming more and more authoritarian, when the European countries see Turkish politics, Turkish policies, the violation of the rights and liberties in Turkey, and the imprisonment of the opposition candidates or opposition politicians. So it's difficult to rewrite the present. So this is why I will explain how the business lobbies rewrite the past in order to keep these economic, at least, relations between Turkey and EU, and in order to underline the importance of Turkey's EU membership for economics, for European economies, and for Turkish economy on both sides. And the third strategy is to, by preparing the future, this means by still continuing to promote Turkey's EU membership and trying to explain, as I've said, trying to fight against the windmills. So promote this membership, even though neither Turkey nor EU promotes this membership. So the Cyprus issue was really interesting. So you see an extract, a quotation from one of my interviewees. So it's a business representative in the textile industry businessmen associations. He told me that so the European Union, so the Cyprus issue was one of the main issues that's blocking the relations between Turkey and EU, especially for the Turkish side, because Turkish people and Turkish businessmen and Turkish officials, government officials, are do no longer have a confidence or vis-à-vis the European institutions, because since the Cyprus, this means that the Greek side of the Cyprus, southern Cyprus, became a member of the European Union before Turkey, and got the veto right in order to block Turkey negotiations with Turkey. This situation was seen as one of the main issues blocking the relations between Turkey and the EU. So this was one of the main issues that was brought up during my interviews with the businessmen. So in the publications and in the press release that they produce in Europe, also in Turkey, this situation or this issue was always brought up and underlined in order to explain to the European Union officials the importance of this situation. So I put a couple of pictures from the publications and from the official press releases of the associations, of the business associations. So a second subject was the customs union. So as I've said, the customs union was the agreement signed by the EU and Turkey in 1995, and the modernization and the renewal of the customs union is an important issue for Turkish businessmen, because as you can see this in these two quotations, in these two interviews, we see that what I learned from my interviewees, that the renewal of the customs union is really important for Turkish businessmen, and if they so if as we see, so if the European Union, they were saying that if the European Union gives the possibility to renew the modernization, to renew the customs union, the Turkish businessmen will work more and more to assure that Turkey can become a member of the European Union. So they were saying that back in the 1990s, the Turkish businessmen were not as strong as today. However, since there are more and more companies who do affairs with European countries, so a renewal of this customs union is really crucial for the Turkish businessmen. So they were always trying to repair the past, repair the Cyprus issue, repair the customs union in order to assure the opening of this horizon of Turkey's EU membership. So again, a couple of pictures from some brochures of the development of the Istanbul Development Foundation, who is also based in Brussels. And several declarations of the business associations, again also in Istanbul and in Brussels. So again, they were underlining the fact that the modernization of the customs union is crucial in order to assure some fairer, greater, and stronger Turkey-EU trade relations. So the second strategy is the rewriting the present. And with the rewriting of present, when I was there, I was the most important subject that was also brought up in my interviews was the coup attempt in Turkey, in the 15 July coup attempt in Turkey. So this was, if you have any questions about this coup attempt, I can also explain. It's really complicated, but so it's some religious confrérie, state-related group attempted a coup, and it's claimed that, of course, these are all claims because nothing has been proven or found out. And the government claims that it was the leader of this religious confrérie, religious group who did this coup attempt. What's important is the use of this coup attempt in order to govern the country, in order to and the role of this the use of this coup attempt in making Turkey a more authoritarian country. So this was also an issue that was brought up and that I found in the business associations. All the associations had these brochures distributed by the government and by the press agency of the related to close to the government. We can say. So these official brochures were distributed by the business associations in Brussels and also in Europe. So in Brussels and also in Istanbul. So they were trying to explain how this coup attempt did not at all cause the authoritarianization of Turkey, or Turkey has, or they were trying to show pictures like from the past was really, so the past was without color, and then the people became together, and then all is, we can see the flag, the Turkish flags with all the colors. So this image, and they were trying to rewrite this present in order to explain to European countries that Turkey is still democratic. Turkey didn't become an authoritarian regime. The people stay together. So you shouldn't believe that Turkey is now an authoritarian country. So on the contrary, we are victorious. We were victorious against this religious leader. So they were trying to always explain. So when I participated a reunion, a meeting with the EU officials, for example, the business associations and businessmen representatives were trying to explain to these EU officials how Turkey is still democratic and the violation of human rights has finished with the military coup, and this is not a violent violent phase of Turkey. So and they were trying to reassure the European officials in order to explain them that Turkey has not become authoritarian because of the situation. This is, for example, an interesting quote. This is from a brochure that I found on Corvée that was distributed again with an association, with a business association in Europe. So it's written that while acknowledging the trauma caused by the failed coup attempt of 15 July 2016 and multiple ongoing terror threats, so as we can see, the monitoring committee is concerned about the implementation of the state of emergency, large-scale and disproportionate effect of the decree laws, including massive dismissal of civil servants, judges, prosecutors, and academics, and the closing down of the media and the NGOs, as well as limited access to judicial remedies. It is yet to be seen how the constitutional amendments will be implemented and whether the foreseen problems in terms of separation of powers and checks and balances between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches can be avoided in the new system of government. So here we see that they do accept the fact that there are dismissal of civil servants, judges, academics, violation of rights in Turkey. However, they say that some constitutional amendments will be made, will be implemented so that the country can recover. So this was the other strategy. And so the last one, and I will conclude with that, the last strategy is the preparing the future. It means that to still working for the European membership of Turkey, despite the fact that neither the government nor the European officials are working for that, or there are no longer negotiations, ongoing negotiations, since everything is suspended. So some brochures. So they were always these businesses. What was interesting and that I learned in the interviews that they were also blaming the European countries. I also, for example, with the first quote, we can see that again a business association, one of the Turkey's biggest business association representative, was stating that the xenophobia in Europe, the racist discourse, has influenced directly Turkey's EU membership, and it has become worse with the migration crisis. The populist policies in Europe, he means, and discourse have made our path longer. The EU asks for advice from us sometimes in order to influence negatively, in order not to influence Turkey negatively. However, in Turkey, some laws passed too fast without asking our opinion. We do not have the control of the situation. So she was telling me that the European side is to blame also because there's a populist discourse in Europe. However, she says that the European officials sometimes ask for their opinion when they try to create relations with the Turkish economists or Turkish businessmen, for example. However, on the other side, the Turkish government, so the AKP government, does not or does rarely ask for their opinion. So because when you do lobbying, you are a connection between the government, the national government, and the European government. However, when the connection between the government, the national government, and you exists no more, it's really difficult to, of course, be a bridge between Europe and between Turkey. So this is why we see that even though there is still a bridge between EU officials and Turkish lobbies in Europe, there is this bridge is just half because there is no connection from the Turkish side. So Turkish government does not ask for the opinion of the lobbies abroad. So this is why it becomes more and more difficult to fight still for Turkey's accession. However, they still promote EU membership, started saying that it's Turkey's start also the putting into putting in so pointing out that as we see that in this quote on the right side, So the Turkey is shocked because the Western Balkan countries, even they are now member of the European Union, and Turkey is still out of the European Union. So there is this discourse also. So not only blaming the Central European countries, but also undermining the Western Balkan countries and saying that we are better than them. However, the Western Balkan countries who are developed, and how come they become EU members, whereas we cannot? So they are also comparing the Western Balkan countries and Turkey. So these are some pictures of several meetings with the officials of these businessmen associations. Of course, we can see there are few women in the reunions and the meetings. So especially this, and then if you can find, there are 4 women in this picture. So as we have seen, so there's really in the end, to conclude, so the businessmen associations, they do their Don Quixote in order to fight against windmills and to lobby where the cause don't still or do not exist, does not exist anymore. So I talked about these 3 main strategies. Related to the past, to the present, and to the future. And the second conclusion that we can see that the lobbying abroad is still possible and plays an important role, even though the cause does no longer exist. The businessmen, and another conclusion is that the businessmen representatives who are anti-government can also cooperate with the government officials in order to work in favor of the EU membership in Europe, since we have seen that they do expect that the AKP government asks for their opinion, even though they don't ask for their opinion. And in the end, another hypothesis is, of course, which will be again tested with other with more field work, is that long distance activism and lobbying in diaspora let Turkey-EU relations negotiations remain despite the internal policies and authoritarian practices. So the aim of the rest of my field work is to see how the newcomers, so the new associations or the new businessmen who were exiled or who migrated to Europe after the military attempt, the coup attempt, how they react, and if they work also for the EU membership of Turkey. So we'll see how the hypothesis will remain or will be refuted maybe. So for now, I will start to see if this long distance activism is coherent with these strategies of the businessmen associations in Turkey. Thank you for your attention. I hope I wasn't too long.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for your presentation. And I would now give the possibility to participants to ask their questions. So if you want to ask a question, you can either raise your hand, raise your hand virtually, not physically, because we won't see it, but or say it in the chat function that you would like to say something or ask something. Let's see if we have somebody who is willing to give us a start. It's always a little bit hard to see it in a virtual way. I mean, one thing I was struck by is how critical the statement by the IKV, I don't know how you pronounce it, was of the government of Turkey, right? I mean, they were quite, I mean, you mentioned these, it acknowledged the coup, but at the same time, it talked about these abuses. And this was, I mean, strikingly critical, I would say, of the government. So how do this group stand within Turkish business community? I mean, how are they marginal in terms of the Turkish business community at large, or do they reflect a broader concern? How do you, in a certain way, locate these long distance activists, so to speak, or lobbyists within the larger context of the business community in Turkey? Because as far as, I mean, again, I'm not an expert on Turkey, but my understanding has always been that especially the kind of smaller businesses, some sectors also bigger businesses have been very closely associated with the AKP, so that they are very much, that it's a party also of businessmen in many ways. So how does this fit together?
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting because since the IKV has started or has started its or has moved to Brussels after the customs union, so it was the 1995, so it was the 1990s. So back then it was possible, it was still possible to have this opposition to the government, and especially these were some businessmen who had a less, of course, less Islamist, less conservative, and more progressive, and sometimes more Kemalist background. So defending the establishment, defending this Republican side of Turkey. So when the AKP came into power, they stayed in a marginal situation. So this is why they didn't become, and they are still not the dominant actor in the business sphere, in the economic sphere. So this is why, and especially when I said that the business lobbies and diaspora of Turkey in Europe is changing, because these small and conservative entrepreneurs, investors, Turkish businessmen start to move to Europe, and they become the dominant actors. So the associations like the IKV or TÜSİAD are becoming more and more marginal. So they remain their relations with the businessmen, with the small conservative businessmen, because they are obliged to, because they have to. But they just during an interview they do talk about these subjects. However, when you observe them during a meeting, a larger meeting, they do not show their anti or critical position. And these brochures they distribute, but in these brochures there is always a bright side. So they always see that but the country will become more democratic. So there is also a hope that they are expecting. So this is why they have this double position. On one hand, anti-government, and on the other side, inside the economic field.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in a certain way, the key point is that they're marginal in the overall business environment. So are they competing against other Turkish lobbying groups in Brussels, which are, you know, more pro-government? Is there in a certain way a competition also of the narrative?
Yeah, exactly. What I observed was that the meetings organized by these pro-AKP businessmen in Brussels were larger meetings, whereas the meetings organized by the IKV, for example, were more small committees, and they, for example, they invite the students, Turkish students who are in Brussels or who are in Belgium, the academicians who are in Belgium, so the university researchers, Turkish researchers who are based in Brussels, they always invite these people in order to compensate their situation, their marginal situation. So they are in a competition. This is why, for example, they use the brochures that are distributed by the government on the July coup. So because they try to legitimate themselves by saying that we are not that marginal, we also use the brochure that was distributed by the government on the July coup. So they try to become also, they try to just hide their marginal side because they're not trying to change the roles and becoming dominant, but they are just trying to not to be seen or the stay in the low profile in order to not to be out of the economic field or the lobbying in Turkey, in Brussels. So it's really interesting. They have this schizophrenic situation and strategy that they do. We do know that this is IKV is a more Kemalist association. However, on the other hand, you can find some pro-AKP declarations or brochures distributed also by the association, because they do not want to be accepted that marginal.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I think we have Gül who would like to ask a question. So I would like to give her the floor. If she could just activate her microphone and her camera, and then she can ask you her question in person.
Yeah.
Hi, yes, we see you. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And there was a lot of details which I wasn't aware of also about this big lobbying force, and especially the part of the preparing for the future of Turkey-EU relations. I found very, I don't know, I mean, a little bit cute, because I don't know whether we will have these kind of relations developing more positively in the future, or also just in general about the EU, the function of the EU, the European Union in the coming time. But my question would be, after the AKP come to power in Turkey, they had this relationship with the Gülen movement, and as an outcome of that, a lot of Gülen businessmen grew big in Turkey. Have they also been part of these lobbying forces in different European countries? You are looking on the case of Brussels, but I don't know, maybe also in general in different parts of Europe, whether they have been active forces in these lobbies, and whether there have been any changes afterwards. And also one more question I have about because the lobbying forces started in the 1990s, and the AKP came in 2002, and they have had many changes. You know, in the beginning they were very pro-Europe, but then they changed around 2008, 2010. There was the Gezi time. Have there been any changes around the Gezi? I'm also interested in. So if, I know it's before your time frame of what you're looking at, but maybe you came across it during literature review or in talks during your time.
Thank you for your questions and for your interest. So, like, yeah, it's a really good question. As for I will start with the Gezi when I have because I have less elements to respond. So I will start with this one. So for the Gezi, well, I mostly looked after the 2016, but during my interviews. They told me that during the Gezi, they also tried to explain also always to the EU officials that this wasn't a coup, this wasn't a negative things that was going on in Turkey. So they were also in this attitude of explaining to Europe that everything is going okay in Turkey. Everything is okay. Everything is fine. Everything is under control. So for example, they told me that they tried to reassure the European officials and the EU investors, so European investors who were maybe planning to open up business in Turkey. They told me that they were always trying to reassure them that this will end in the end. Everything will be okay. So this resistance will not have negative consequences. So it's always the strategy of reassuring European business and investors and EU officials, saying that everything is gonna be okay. So it's not a revolution. It won't be like the Arab Spring. So it was always this fear of will Turkey become like the Arab Spring, and the economy will lose business, and foreign investors will not come in Turkey. So this is why they were more afraid that the business will no longer want to go, the foreign investors will no longer want to go to Turkey, so that they were trying to reassure the European officials, European side. And for the second question, the strategy that I observed, what I observed and what I read a little bit in the literature about the Gülen group, the Gülenists and their economic associations, I saw that they were more in a strategy of investing Europe and Asia rather than staying, or even United States, rather than staying in Europe. So there was a clash a little bit they were saying that so we invested in Europe. This was the 1990s. Looking into Europe.
Just to clarify, you mean in Turkey?
Yeah, in Turkey.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so this was so the Turkish businessmen were saying that we have already opened up business in Europe. So now it's time to sign agreements with African countries, with Asian countries, with countries who were ignored since the 1990s. So it was rather an opening to new countries. Rather than reinvesting Europe. So I saw, and since when I was there, all the Gülenist associations were closed. So I didn't observe really in place if there were any competition maybe before.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Gül, also for your question. I think we have Petra who would like to ask a question next. So I would ask Petra to activate her microphone and camera, and Gül to leave us. So we have our next question there. Petra, are you? Can you also turn on the camera so we can see you as well? It's much nicer.
Sorry. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
We can hear you. We can't see you yet.
Okay, I will see if the camera works. If not, I will just ask.
We saw you earlier, so you should.
The host has stopped it. Okay.
I will see if I can. I will allow you to hopefully
start my video.
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your presentation. I would just like to ask, did you came across during your research to the question of corruption? Because this seems, at least in Slovenia, is like when you connect politics, business, the corruption is somewhere there.
Not that much, but good question. It's true, you're right. But it has never came up at this in my interview. So maybe just in the textile sector industry association, the representative told me while he was comparing the 1990s and the 2000s, he told me that today in the business there are people who don't know the business, who do not come from a businessman background, so they do not know how to do affairs. So this is why they told me that this is why back in the 1990s everyone knew the importance of the customs union. However, today they just deturn the rules and they find another way to earn money. So I think it was just the only reference that I've heard during my interview. So I thought of this when you asked the question. So he told me that he was comparing the businessmen today, so the pro-government businessman and the businessman, the good businessman for him back in the 1990s, who knew how to do business with the rules. Whereas now they determine the rules and they don't know what to do. They earn some money to somehow. So he was saying this. I think implying that there was a corruption. He was also talking about the corruption. But well, in reality, 1990s were also the year of huge corruptions in Turkey. So I think he was just in a nostalgia of 1990s, reading the 1990s from today. So it was also really interesting for us.
Great, okay, thank you. Thank you, Petra, for the question. We have Anna who is asking next. So Anna, you could turn on your camera and your microphone.
Of course. Okay, thanks. Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question regarding trade unions in Turkey, whether you encountered some kind of communication between these long distance lobbying groups and like local trade unions, as you actually did that for your PhD. So I guess you're very familiar with both sides. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So you mean the relations between Turkish trade unions and in Europe, or?
Turkish trade unions locally with these lobbyist business association groups.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Well, there were, well, for example, during the meetings that I attended in Brussels, there were no labor representative. So this was an issue. So when I was in the businessmen associations, it was always economics and business and the relations between the government that were brought up as subjects. So it was really interesting that they were. It was at least it was like as if the business is the only side of economic affairs or economic life. However, I also conducted, I didn't talk about it, but I also conducted a couple of interviews, 4 interviews in Business Europe, which is a European businessman associations federation. And there, the two European business representatives in Business Europe have told me that when they do meetings, that they organize meetings with the Turkey side and in order to see what's going on in Turkey when it comes to economic and social affairs, they do invite both trade union representatives and business representatives. So I think since I since the part that I talk about was the businessmen associations in Turkey from Turkey, so there we don't see any labor representatives, which is not shocking really. So considering the role of Turkish labor unions in the negotiations, in the tripartite negotiations with the employers, government, and labor. But on the European side, when Business Europe, so the federation, European Federation, organized meetings on Turkey, they told me that they also have representatives from the labor side. So they do have relations, but the European, the Turkish trade unions have really close ties with the European trade union confederations and international trade union confederations. So I think this is thanks to that relation that the Turkish trade union representatives get to be invited to the Business Europe meetings. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anna, for the question. Let's see if there are any last questions and from the audience. I think this is not the case. Now, I wanted to ask you something. You were mentioning, maybe it's a methodological question. You said you will do online field work, and because, of course, all of us are thinking about this these days. What is your impression and the challenges of doing field work in these circumstances?
Yeah. Yes, I think the main challenge will be to convince someone to join maybe on Skype or on Zoom or on WhatsApp to talk for, I don't know, for at least half an hour. So it's a really question. I say it's one of the things that I'm still trying to organize. For now, I'm trying to get an appointment. So see if when people are available. The advantage is that since for now everyone is working from home, they are just relatively more available. So there are no meetings, or meetings that there are, but it's online too. So it's an advantage. However, a disadvantage is that is to convince someone giving maybe his or her phone number to talk on WhatsApp or joining my Skype so that we can chat, so that we can talk. I think it's more on the personal and the personal identification side, which they are afraid of. And since they cannot verify if I'm not recording the conversation, so because some of the representatives did not want me to record the conversation, record my interview. So since now they will not be able to control this, I think they also will be. It will be a challenge to convince them. I will write to you. I will write to you when I have news, and in order to get you keep you informed.
Thanks, Davin. I think this is exactly the kind of concerns I've been having. That I think you, as you exactly said, it's easier to find people in the sense that people are not traveling around the world, but at the same time, the level of intimacy, the conversation, the informality as well, which is so important in these, because of course, when we have a Zoom or a Skype conversation, it's always very it's easy if you know people already, but if it's about building trust or also confidence,
Yeah.
it's much harder, especially as you're also dealing with sensitive issues.
Yeah, exactly.
We have Kirsten who would like to ask another question, so I would ask her to activate her microphone and her camera, please. Yes, we can see you. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation and for the interesting insights. I would like to ask if it was hard or difficult, or even maybe it was easy for you to gain access to this research field. And are there some obstacles for you as a female researcher in this male-dominated field?
Yes, thank you. Well, as of course, as every field, this was also difficult to access, and especially since I was working on trade unions, I didn't, for example, I had to hide my PhD subject, so I didn't, of course, tell these businessmen that I was working on trade unions and I was just working on labor representatives before, because it creates also some kind of mistrust. So I just told them that I'm working on economics and on labor studies in Turkey. So it was, at first it was difficult, and then I realized that they invite, especially to their reunions, lots of students and scholars who are based in Brussels or who are based in Europe. So I had this opportunity to, I knew a scholar, a researcher, a Turkish researcher, who had close relations with them because she made an internship in one of these associations, and she was also like in a political stance close to them, so more Kemalist and everything. So she introduced me to to one of these business associations, and then I told them that I was a researcher, I was a student. So sometimes I told them that I was a student. Sometimes I told them that I was a researcher, and it was and they did accept me. And well, I think since these were the associations that are anti-government for now and that are more marginal, it's easier, relatively easier to access. I think the difficult part will be now in order to access to these some I don't know, some of, maybe I think what could be more difficult is if I was, for example, looking for pro-government businessmen, which I did when I was in Turkey. In Turkey, I did try to look for pro-AKP businessmen, and it was really hard for me. I did one interview with a businessman in metal industry, and then when I asked for a second interview, he didn't give me an interview because I think in between he did a small research on me, maybe online, and I did work on the metal trade union in Turkey, so I didn't get a second appointment, for example, with him. So conducting interviews in Istanbul was more difficult, and being in Europe gave me this mobility and this possibility to still conduct interviews.
Great. Well, thank you, Kirsten, for the question. And I think we've really exhausted our time, but I think this was very exciting. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us, and good luck with the further fieldwork, despite all the obstacles you and we all have. And thank you all of the participants for joining us today and asking questions. Yes. The next Brownbag will be next week.
Thank you for the questions, and good luck everyone to you too.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.